Hey, welcome back to the series on the sidebar Vulcan.js codebase. So in previous videos, I kind of did an overview of the main areas of the components code, server code, but it was a very high-level overview, kind of horizontal, if you will. And this time I want to do the opposite and go deep into a single feature and see how it's built across the different domains, like the components, the server, the client modules, and so on. And the feature we're going to look at today is the new sidebar Webring. So this is a feature I just worked on yesterday. I basically built it all in one day. So it's fairly fresh. It might still change in the future, but hopefully not too much. And what it does is basically it lets sidebar users submit their own site to be part of the sidebar Webring, and if it's accepted, two things happen. One, their sites appear here, and also their the posts from their RSS feeds from those sites automatically get imported into sidebar and end up in the feed right here. So this is the same feed as the main sidebar feed, like it's the same kind of posts, but restricted to sites that came from the Webring. And here in the admin area, you can see that they have this little icon here. So they're also pending, like regularly submitted posts, but since they have this icon, I can kind of look them up and see that they have, at least this recommendation rather than just being some random submitted post. And the other thing also, of course, is that it saved me time because these are sites I often check anyway. So rather than having to go manually check them, copy the URL, add the post automatically gets imported and I can approve it, I can edit it, and so on. So I'm hoping it will be a pretty useful feature. But what makes it cool for our needs today is that it's really a feature that spans across a lot of things, like I said. So, well, let's start as usual with our model. So modules here, you can see there's a new sites directory, which has a schema for the Webring sites model. And as I said, this time I'm really gonna go in depth. So basically almost line by line. And let's start here with the schema. So we have an ID field, which is required for every Mongo document. It's optional because it gets added by MongoDB after the validation of the document. So here this refers to what happens at validation time. And at that time, ID doesn't exist yet, so we mark it as optional. Otherwise, it would throw an error. Created that. It has an onCreate callback that returns the current date, so it basically defaults to right now. In the future, I might make this kind of a default field because it's almost always something you need, this and updated that. They might end up being just default Vulkan fields that you wouldn't have to specify, but for now, you still have to. Title. So this is the first field that's actually mutable, modifiable by the user. And here you can see we can specify who can read the field. So any guest, meaning any connection, any user, even if they don't have a user account, can read site's title. Who can create one? Well, you do need a user account. So that's what members refers to. And then who can update? Owners and admins. So owners is kind of a virtual group. It refers to any user who owns the document as defined by their user ID being the same as the document's user ID field. It's just kind of a convention in Vulkan. And then admin is any user that's marked as admin. And normally, like, admins are supposed to be able to edit any field of any document, so it shouldn't be required, but I think there's a small bug somewhere. So for now, let's leave that in. It might go away in the future. And then label is what you want to appear in the form. So in this case, site title. URL is very similar. Feed URL also. Twitter screen name. These are all string fields that have the same basic permissions. Now this one is interesting, user ID. A couple things are going on. First, we are wrapping the entire field with this make autocomplete function imported from Vulkan core. And this is what we call a field decorator. It's basically a way to take a field definition object such as this one or this one and then automatically add extra properties. So the first argument is the field, and the second is some options for the autocomplete. In this case, autocomplete property name refers to the name right here. So let's go to our admin area. Sorry, we're on the sites model. Right here, when I'm gonna type, it's gonna autocomplete, and those values are the autocomplete property name. In this case, I want to autocomplete on the display name property. In the future, it might be cool to autocomplete on multiple properties, you know, so maybe this would work, but this in one word would work. In one word would work too, because it's my Twitter username. Currently, it doesn't work, so currently you do have to pick one property. But then once we pass all that through the make autocomplete function, basically it picks the right input type, it pre-fills, it writes the query to you know, load that data, and it does a lot of work behind the scenes for us. And the idea is to have more and more of these decorators so that you can not only specify the input type, but also define more of the form field's behavior. And then the other thing that's important to look at is this relation. We define that the field has a relation on the user type. It's a has one relation, and it's going to resolve as a user field in the GraphQL schema. So if I look at the type Webring site, you can see it has a user field of type, well, user. And that's what the relation does. So it not only defines that schema for you, but the resolver that actually fetches the user kind of filters out the fields that you don't have access to, takes care of caching with data loader. All that is done for you as well. So relations are a super useful feature. And then status, pretty standard. It has a default value as well as an onCreate callback. That seems a bit redundant, but I was having trouble with default value. So in some cases, you know, because only admins can set the status of a site, maybe that was tricking up, messing up default value. Anyway, the other last thing is options, which is the options that you see right here. So that's for the schema of the site's model. Fairly simple, as you can see. What else do we have? We have the collection, of course. We can look at the permissions, who can read the list or who can access the site's model. Anybody can. Who can create a site, a logged in user, update, delete, owners. So you might be wondering why we have permissions here and we also had them here. Well, that's because the permissions defined at the collection level are permissions to access the collection as a whole, or the model as a whole. So these permissions apply to all documents, all sites. And now these permissions apply to specific fields of a site. So the status field is a good example. Even if we want anybody to be able to access any site and any title, any URL, we don't want everybody to be able to modify the status. And sometimes you'll have private fields within a public model. So we might want to do this, right? Restrict who can read a specific field, even if all the documents are public. So that's why we have these two tiers of permissions. In fact, here, I should probably replace this by a function that checks the status of the site, which is what we're doing for posts. Sorry, wrong file. This one, yeah. Here you can see can read is actually a function that checks the document and the current user to know if a document can be accessed. So that's for posts, because we have pending posts which shouldn't be public. We do also have pending Webring applications, pending sites which shouldn't be public, but for now, you know, it's not a huge deal if that data is still accessible via the API. And then we have a fragment. We are actually defining two fragments. This is something I've started doing recently, where we'll have our main fragment, but the fields are separate. And that's because sometimes you will want to reuse just this in some other model. So in this case, in the user fragment, I want to extend, let's see how to explain this. I want to extend the current user fragment, which is one of the default fragment in Vulkan, which controls what data is loaded for the current user. I want to make sure the current user also loads all their Webring sites. And then if I had used this full Webring site fragment, it would create a recursion where the user loads their site and their sites load their user, which loads the site, and so on. So it wouldn't work. By breaking off just the fields of the Webring and not any of the related models, I'm able to reuse this right here and not get any trouble with nesting and so on. Okay, so that's it for the fragments, and that's it for our sites directory in the modules directory. And as you might remember, this is kind of the core of any model, and the rest is going to be server-side stuff and components. So let's start with the components. The main one is here, webring.jsx, and it corresponds to this page right here. As you can see, there's lots going on. There's an intro, a button, a list of member sites, and here a feed for the latest posts from the Webring sites. So it's all here. We have some markdown content that's then passed to the React Markdown package. Right above, we have our page layout, and I'm passing titles and descriptions. This is something I just added to you know, take care of the actual title, page title here, the metadata. It's pretty handy to do this, and it is actually relying on a pre-made Vulkan core component called components.headTags, where you can pass the title, description, and URL, and it will set all the relevant meta tags, so the Facebook tags, the Twitter tags, based on that. So that's what we're doing here. Then we have a button, apply to join, wrapped in a link container from React, React Router Bootstrap, just to make sure that our Bootstrap components work as React Router links. We have our paginated list component from Vulkan, which takes a collection, a fragment name, an input, and then displays a paginated list. In this case, we don't have enough items to require pagination, but we don't want pagination anyway, so oh, sorry, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a way to disable pagination, but in this case, we probably just will pass a really high limit if we reach the pagination limit. Anyway, we can see the input that's being used here, and we are filtering by Webring status.approved. So this wouldn't be necessary to do if we had our if we were restricting the permissions here, because only the approved site would become readable by guests. But it's probably a good idea to just specify this here, just to avoid inconsistencies. Otherwise, admins and guests wouldn't get the same content. So yeah, specifying, all your filtering options is always a good idea. We could probably do like limit 1999 or something to just make sure we always show every single site here as well. And the components property is how we override a specific item or specific subcomponent in the paginated list component. In this case, paginated list item, which we override with Webring list item, which is right here. We're just passing the document to Webring site cell. This being how we display a single Webring site. So basically this little thing right here. There's nothing really special going on, except that when we can, we will display an edit button. And this is based on whether we are passing a current user, which we are not here, but we are when people look at their own account. So in this view, the edit button does appear to let people change their details. These sites were all submitted by me, right? So their user ID still corresponds to my own user account, which is why they appear. But ideally, of course, it would show you your own sites that you submitted yourself. Let's go back to webring.jsx. Then we have something pretty interesting here with the portal. So a portal is a React feature that lets you inject content in a different part of your DOM. So I kind of copied that from some tutorial and modified it a little bit. Portals, I didn't find them quite easy to use, especially if you want to use them with server-side rendering, which doesn't work right now. So you'll see, yeah, you'll see it pops in a little bit later, but it's not a huge deal, and at least it works. So I'm not going to get into details about that now, but what you need to know is the portal, I guess, pops into existence here in the sidebar. So this is a layout that's actually a different layout from the page layout we have here. So if we look at in development, if we look at the component 3, we have our layout here that wraps everything, every page, and then we have our page layout here that's a layout for specifically the page content. So it's more like this part, the title, and so on. And as you can see, like, page layout is explicitly included in the page, so it's just a component. It doesn't do anything special, it's just wrapping the page. But layout, on the other hand, that's like a special component that's automatically wrapped around every route in your app. The downside of that, of course, is that you cannot access it very easily from here. We're not doing this and passing it props like we do with page layout. So this is why I had to resort to portals, which kind of teleport this into a different part of the site. In this case, the sidebar of sidebar. And what's inside this sidebar? Well, we have a Webring feed with, again, the paginated list component. And this is what I was talking about. I'm actually passing an empty component to paginated list load more, just to make sure we never get this load more button. Instead, I have a view more button that's just a link to a different page here. Yeah, I just wanted to send people to a different page where the feed has more room to grow rather than kind of constrain it into this small sidebar when there's more items. Okay, so that's it for webring.jsx. What else do we have? We have a webring apply, which is this page right here. Again, not too complicated. We have some text and then a form. The text comes from Markdown, defined right here, and then the form, super simple. We have a collection and a success callback that pushes the user to /webring/thanks. No options here because there's nothing super complicated going on with the form, so we're just using the default form generated out of the box by the smart form component. And then if you submit, you'll get a few errors if there's missing fields, but then you end up here. Again, very simple component. And then what else do we have here? We have the feed that we saw. Yeah, this is just the icon that shows up in the admin area. Speaking of which, maybe it's a good time to look at that. So yeah, that's what the dashboard looks like. If you've used Vulkan, you might be familiar with the data table component, which makes up the dashboard. It's got the new button, edit button. Again, these are completely default. It's got the 2 custom columns. So the columns are defined right here, and 4 of them are just going to take the field and display it. So these 4, and then we have 2 that have a bit more formatting, and they're using custom column components. Status just shows you a small indicator for the status, this thing. And then action is more interesting. So actions is for pending sites. It gives you this segmented control where you can approve or reject. Here's how it works. We have a bunch of Bootstrap code, React Bootstrap, but all this basically triggers 2 functions: approve site or reject site. And these come from right here. So approve site, it's async. It sets the input objects data.status to approved, and then it calls update site on that input. So what's going on here? Well, update site is a function that comes from a hook called useUpdate2. And useUpdate2 is gives you access to the update mutation on the server. So every Vulkan model out of the box has these CRUD mutations, create, update, delete, upsert, and so on. And of course, you can call them through GraphQL. So they have update Webring site. It has a GraphQL definition here. It has resolvers all generated for you, and you can call them with Apollo or graphical. It's just regular GraphQL. But in addition to that, Vulkan has these hooks that make calling these default mutations super easy. How do they work? Well, you define them like this. You pass a collection name and a fragment name, and you get an array of 2 objects. The first one is going to be the mutation, the function to call on the client to trigger the mutation. And second one is some options on the status of the mutation. So called becomes true when the mutation is called. And loading is true while it's loading and becomes false once it's not anymore. So both approve site and reject site use the same update site function, which calls the same, update Webring site mutation on the server. The only difference is they call it with a different status. So that's what's going on here. If you're looking at the code base, you might remember that admin post. Admin post is doing something very similar, but it's instead of calling use update 2, it's calling use register mutation. And this is useful to call any arbitrary mutation on the server. So use update 2 is specifically to call update whatever. Use register mutation can call any mutation, including that or some custom mutations like approve posts, spam post. I could have written, approve sites, reject site mutations on the server if I wanted to do something more custom. But in this case, it wasn't really necessary. There's not a ton of processing that goes on. It's just basically switching a flag. So I didn't need to write custom mutations, and the default ones do just fine. Okay, what else do we have here? Well, we do have this import feeds button. Speaking of custom mutations, good segue actually. We are overriding the data table above right component of the data table, which, as you might imagine, is this area right here. And we are keeping the new button. So I just copy pasted that from the default data table above right component, but we are adding this mutation button component. Mutation buttons are special buttons that call a mutation on the server. What's really cool is that they also show you a loading indicator while the mutation is going on, and even if you get an error, it will show you a small tooltip. So, when you're building these kind of dashboard, having to call a mutation on the server is a super common thing, and usually the UI component that's going to trigger that is a button, and so mutation button just does all of that for you. So you specify the mutation options, so the name of the mutation. There's no arguments here. You can probably even remove that. And then what to do when the mutation is successful. In this case, show an alert. What this mutation does is it will trigger the import of all the RSS feeds. So let's take a look right now. You can see it's gonna look at the different feeds, look there if there's any new items, and import the result. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time, and sometimes there's errors, but it seems to be doing okay. And yeah, it concluded, said done, imported 0 new posts. So this is a really cool way to trigger the RSS feed import. There's also a cron job, but I wanted a way to do it manually. And well, let's take a look at this import from RSS mutation then, because I think we're about done for components. So now let's look at the server right here. Not too complex. So we define the mutation resolver, the function that gets executed when the resolver, when the mutation runs. We add it to the mutation resolver map. We also define the actual mutation schema in GraphQL. We return JSON because that's the most flexible, just a JSON blob. And then the mutation itself, we call import RSS feeds, which is right here. This is kind of a really, I don't know, not simple, but kind of basic function that just gonna go take all the sites, go through them, do a fetch on their feed using the this RSS parser package I found. Get the items for each item, build a post, submit the post, check that it exists. If it doesn't exist, submit it. You'll notice we are using create mutator here instead of just doing a post.insert or something. So a mutator in Vulkan is a function that inserts or mutates data, but does so by going through all the validation step, the callback steps. So whenever you see in a schema, sorry, I cannot touch type with this MacBook keyboard, so I always make typos when screencasting. All these things, these options, the onCreate, onUpdate callbacks, these all run when you call a mutator. If you were to insert this in the database directly, they wouldn't run. So that's why it's always a good idea to use the mutators if you can. And we just pass it a few options. And the cool thing is it will also run the callbacks, which reminds me actually, yeah, the post callback is probably a good idea to make sure that there's nothing that we do not want to do. But I think in this case, they're all, yeah, so all these will run, but not these because we passed validate false. So you can control which callbacks run a little bit. But anyway, the idea is more to have the assurance that your callbacks, your validation, and so on will run if you need them to. So that's for mutators. That's for the RSS import. What else do we have here? We have a collection on the server which extends the collection on the client, or rather in modules. And we do that to be able to add the callbacks. Get Twitter metadata. We use this to so that whenever someone submits a site, we fetch their Twitter username and avatar just to get this this little avatar right here. So that's fetched via Twitter. And we have this notification. Every time a site is going to be modified, updated, we're going to check if their status went from pending to approved, and if that's the case, we send an email. Well, let's finish with that actually. So the email is defined right here. So there's two things. There's the email and the template. Starting with the email. Yeah, so the email has, okay, we specify the template, we specify a path for testing, which is useful right here when we're testing emails locally in development. We have this special path to test this specific email. Probably could be auto-generated, but having a manual path lets us specify parameters, which can be useful. So we have a to. How do we get the to email from the data that's passed here? In this case, it's going to be Webring site result user email subject query variables. The query is the important thing because that's how we get that data. The query is going to be defined right here. We are getting some general site data about sidebar itself, and then Webring site. So we hit the Webring site resolver to get the data for a single Webring site, passing our Webring site fragment that we defined earlier, and then we augment that with the email field on the user object, because usually we don't load it. And then that will get passed to the template, which is defined here. Super simple. There's actually only one dynamic value. The template is imported here. And also because it's how Meteor works, we have to add it to assets here. So there you go. I think that's pretty much everything that goes into that Webring feature. The RSS import, the admin area for sites. You then see the post show up in your post dashboard, and then we have that Webring page for members. Oh, one more thing I forgot. I also added this to the user account, so just a small place where they can review their sites. I mentioned it before, but I might as well show you the code for that. So it's super simple. There isn't even any data loading code, and the reason why we're not doing like paginated list like here, like below for the posts, the reason why we can afford not to do that is because this is actually part of the user object. So this touches on another way to load data in Vulkan or in GraphQL apps. You can basically have your own request, right? That's gonna, trigger a separate query to the server, or maybe be batched together with other queries, but pretty much it's its own GraphQL query. Or you can add a field to an existing query. In this case, we already have a query to load the current user. And so because sites are usually going to be pretty few in numbers, there's not going to be any pagination or anything like that. We can just load all the sites on the current user dot Webring sites field. And you can see here we are extending the current user fragment with this field. And I guess the last piece of the puzzle for that was adding this resolver called Webring sites, this API only field, adding that to the user schema. So the name is going to be Webring sites. The type name is an array of Webring site documents, and then the resolver finds all the Webring sites belonging to the current user and passes them through this filtering function. That's gonna make sure that any restricted fields are not going to be viewable by the user. I don't think there are any on this model, but it's always a good practice to add that function. Okay, hopefully this all made sense to you. I think one of the probably hardest things, but also coolest things with Vulkan is understanding how one feature can span across front-end, back-end, React components, cron jobs, back-end scripts, custom mutations, admin area. All these things, typically you would have maybe 2 or 3 different apps to handle them. You might have a Node API that does the heavy lifting on the back end, or you might be using something like, Hasura or PostgreSQL, and then on top of that add things for, Node.js server processing like the RSS import, and then you would have maybe an admin area, and then on top of that a front end for the client. And that's a super powerful, super flexible approach, but it's also a ton of work. With Vulkan, you can kind of merge it all into one thing. Of course, it's still split across different directories and different domains, but domains meaning like different areas of your code and of your app. But it's still one code base, and you can still share code, and it's pretty easy to switch back and forth between the different areas of the feature. And so I was able to build this in a day. I think I built 90% of it in like 4 or 5 hours maybe, and then this morning I added the email notification. So I think that's fairly fast. I'm sure it could go faster if some things were less confusing, maybe once we have better autocomplete or better docs, just to make sure you don't have to spend any time looking things up. But overall, I think it's still pretty cool, still pretty fast. And once you master Vulkan, well, hopefully you too can be just as fast or faster. So I'm gonna finish right here. Thanks for tuning in. The next video I make could be on another feature, or another idea I had was just to do a Q&A video about the code base in general. So if there's anything you didn't understand in this video, in the previous videos, or just the code base itself, let me know in the comments or let me know in the Vulcan.js Slack, and I'll address all those questions in an upcoming video. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more very soon. Bye.